Your mistake is to reduce God to nothing more than a property. This completely goes against monotheism in that
First off, I didn't say that God was nothing more than a property. I merely pointed out that when Christians use is when saying Jesus is God and the Father is God, that they aren't making a strict logical identity statement like you would see in Western analytic philosophy. I don't think God is a property. I think God is a tripersonal being. My interlocutor asserts that if multiple people have the attribute of being God, then that means that there are multiple gods. But why think a thing like that? If those multiple distinct people are all part of the same God, it wouldn't entail polytheism. When he asserts this, he's assuming the very thing he's trying to argue. It's at this point I will note that in the ancient Near Eastern world in which Judaism and Christianity came out of, it was common to think that a deity could have fluidity and personhood. In this, I mean that a single deity could have multiple persons who are distinct from each other, yet they are all the same deity. It was also commonly thought that one singular deity could be embodied in multiple objects here on earth. For more on this, see the book Bodies of God by Ben Sommer. All of this is to say that my view of divinity is completely consistent with the ancient Near Eastern world that the Israelites lived in and what the ancient Israelites wrote themselves. He then asserts that if there is one God, then any person we say is that one God must be the same person. And again, this depends on what we mean when we say is. I think God is identical to a tripersonal being. When I say Jesus is God, I'm not saying that Jesus is identical to the Trinity, because that wouldn't make sense. Jesus is just one person of the Trinity. Rather, I'm saying that Jesus is the same substance or essence of this triune God and is thus divine. Now, my objector then presents a thought experiment in which he describes an old person who is a politician and is currently president. And because there's only one president, we know from this description that he must be Joe Biden. And if I say my uncle is president, then we know that this is the same person as the old politician just mentioned. It's like saying that my uncle is Joe Biden. I'll note here that in the case of presidents, there can only be one person at a time who is president. And my objector, in applying this analogy to God, assumes implicitly that there can only be one person who is God. This is something I obviously disagree with. If there could be multiple people at a time who are president, then his example would fail. Similarly, because I think that there are multiple people who are God, this comparison doesn't faze me as an analogy, as it has a pretty significant symmetry breaker. But again, there are issues here with my objector not understanding that not all is statements are statements of strict numerical identity. And really, most of his remarks just fail to recognize this distinction. I would say that in a strict numerical identity statement, God is identical to the Trinity. When Christians say that Jesus is God and the Father is God, we are not saying Jesus is numerically identical to the Trinity and that the Father is numerically identical to the Trinity. And if you don't understand what these terms means, please look up Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and learn what I mean when I say identity statements like this. The central problem with all these objections to the Trinity is that they assume that it is impossible for one God to be manifest in multiple persons. Yet all of their logic that tries to show this assumes the very thing that they are trying to argue, and my objector in this video is a perfect example of this. Everybody just assumes their conclusion as their starting point.